Salutations, respected viewers. I have been asked by a loyal viewer to do a video on the manifestations of global socialism. Well, this takes some definition. What is socialism? And it's difficult to spell that out because it comes in a plethora of forms, and like any ideology, it's forever evolving, adapting itself to new situations, and new contributions are made. People drop this or that aspect of socialism. It's a latitudinarian ideology, if even ideology is the word. It's about politics and economics, and so there's often a spirited debate amongst socialists, democratic socialists, social democrats, about what it is, and these terms are all problematic. But some of these nostra can be found as far back as ancient Greece, to do with common ownership and some sort of welfare system. So socialists would say they care about the common good. So how are we going to provide for the weal of everyone? But socialism, as we know it, the word originated in France around about 1800 with Henri de Saint-Simon coming up with it. He often used it interchangeably with the word industrialism. Now, Saint-Simon, he'd fought in America for the American Revolution. So this will discomfort some Americans who absolutely abominate socialism and think it's somehow inimical to the American way of life, which it isn't. And there are aspects of socialism in every country run by every government. It can just be a bit more, a bit less. But almost no socialist these days advocates public ownership of everything. So Karl Marx, he published his Communist Manifesto in 1848. These days we'd usually draw a distinction between communism and socialism. So Marx popularized the word communist, though it has existed since at least the 1520s, when St. Thomas More wrote his book Utopia. Of course, he was writing that in Latin. But so Marx was not the first socialist, and he wasn't even that popular among socialists in his lifetime, and he was a tendentious figure back then. But there are some observations that he made that most socialists would agree with, that he thought social class really mattered, that economic relations, power relations were often much the same, and abolishing poverty mattered, sharing wealth around a bit more. Why do we have abject poverty, indeed people starving to death, in a world which is so plentiful, where some people have got tens of billions of dollars? Why do some people live in penury? There's something a little bit wrong here. Is it not the maldistribution of wealth? But so what really mattered to him was class, was not nationality, which he felt was a distraction from the class struggle. So he had his theory of history, which he propounded in the Communist Manifesto. It's a very punchy, readable book. You can easily read it in a single sitting. So he believes that in prehistoric times we were tribes of hunter-gatherers, and we cooperated, living in small bands of people. So can common ownership work? Well, we all practice common ownership. It depends at what level, especially doing it voluntarily. Could a husband and wife share a house? Yeah, that's sharing. Share their car? I think so. What if their daughter wants to share the car too? I'm sure they can figure that out. What if the two families next door to each other decide to build a swimming pool together and share it? Could they do that? I think they could, voluntarily. What if everybody in the street wants to do this, share this pool that they all contribute to? Becomes a bit more problematic, but it's doable. And the larger the unit is, the harder it is, because someone thinks I can contribute a bit less and take a bit more and get away with it. And it's not really harming everyone. I'm harming everybody else just a tiny, tiny amount. And then obviously governments try and do it and organise it, and sometimes it's not voluntary, there's some compulsion. Because I don't know anybody who says we should have no public ownership whatsoever. What's a public benefit? What sort of public services should be provided? And which things should be left up to other people? Well, that is far too large a question for me to ponder here. So I'm giving you some sort of idea about socialism. Often these countries, people sometimes say are socialists, the Scandinavian ones, they have extensive social welfare. And so despite providing people's needs in that sense, they don't own housing or enterprises generally. These are usually privately owned. In that sense, it's a capitalist system. So Marx noted that as we are one species, we have problems in common, and there is no difference of principle between one nation and the next, or one social class and the next, or one religion and the next. So stop dividing ourselves and try and work together. but he felt that the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie so often tried to exploit the proletariat and the peasantry, and the poor got a very raw deal. And so the profit motive that would drive people to charge the highest possible price and pay the lowest possible wage to get the maximum profit, and the mighty would drive the weak to the wall and just grind them down, pay them wages if they could. So he felt that so often the capitalist class wanted to keep the masses just above the grave, wanted some unemployment, because then people would be desperate and would accept wages and conditions no matter how dreadful. So laws of supply and demand, they want there to be more demand for jobs and supply of them, put it the other way around. They want there to be more of a supply of labour than there is a demand for it, and on and on. And then we have this curious anomaly where there's this crisis of overproduction. Producing more stuff ought to make us richer. Let's say, look at the United States when the Great Depression struck, the most industrially and technologically advanced country in the world, and there were lots of fridges and telephones and cars that couldn't be sold. Not a lot of people could afford them. So there they were, just not being used. How wasteful is that? If we gave them away, that would enrich people. If you got a fridge when you didn't have before, you're richer than you were before, even if you can't sell it on, your life is easier. But the shop and the factory say, well, we mustn't do that, because then we'll never sell it. So they hang on to it, and it's never used, and that's crazy. Now, I know socialism and communism have inefficiencies and have screwed up terribly sometimes. I'm an implacable opponent of communism, and indeed I'm an anti-socialist, right? But socialism isn't always entirely dreadful, any more than capitalism is always splendid and successful, almost as though we never had recessions and depressions and so forth. So we ought to resolve our disputes peaceably where possible, and often it is possible. And people usually fight over ideology or resources, often the two. Ideology could be religion, could be politics. Resources could be just land for farming, or there's oil, or there's whatever. So nation states, as we know them, were coming into existence in the late 18th century, in the 20th century, with the spread of literacy, with the spread of printing, certainly outside of China, with mass conscription, with roads finally getting quite good, and eventually had railways and telegraphs to really speed up transport and communications. We had ways to keep armies in the field for long enough to supply them with tin food and things like that. We organised sports with national flags, only came into being often in the 18th century, national anthems, compulsory schooling to manufacture an identity. So often one nation is built on the bones of another. No nation has always existed. They all had to come into being at some point. But nation states, as I say, mostly brought about then. Usually they had one official language. Sometimes they got more than one. A central government, laws which are largely the same throughout the nation, but might be divided into states with laws a bit different in different parts of the nation. So there is no difference of principle between one nation state and the next, or one sovereign state and a sub-sovereign unit. I know in international law we try and say that there is, but often sovereign states be part of another. Republic of Ireland, we used to be part of the United Kingdom. Is the Republic of Ireland or is the UK, are they even sovereign anyway because of the European Union? These things are not clear-cut. Much though some people who invest a great deal of emotion in them pretend that they are, cut and dried, they're not. It's blurred, it's uncertain, and it's forever changing. So international cooperation, socialists are supposedly into that, though it's a rather vociferous movement. But people who are non-socialists, indeed anti-socialists, have often tried to cooperate. Before, we've had international conferences for centuries, treaties and so on. That's some kind of international cooperation. But to go back to the early days of socialism, there's the Congress of Vienna, 1850 to 1820. So after the defeat of Napoleon, the various European governments, they met at Vienna to try and thrash out what the new situation was to be, put the French genie back in its bottle and all the rest of it. And incidentally, they came up with the Vienna Convention on the treatment of diplomats, on diplomatic immunity. So diplomats couldn't be taken hostage, so that their embassies were secure. Police were not going to go barging into there. And that's been a core component of international law ever since. And even enemy countries have tried to uphold this for each other. Even in the First World War, even the Second World War, Central Powers, allied countries, they let the diplomats go. They didn't burst into the embassy until war was declared, and so on. Or let's say when the United States diplomats in Iran were taken hostage in 1979, the Soviet Union protested vigorously. Or when the British diplomatic compound was violated in Iran several years ago, Again, countries like China and Russia, which are not friendly towards the UK, they protested vigorously, which is notable. We've had the International Court of Justice since the 1860s, and the United States indeed took to the UK to over-equipping the Alabama, a ship which was built for the Confederacy. So we've had all sorts of conferences. So people often say that you cannot have absolute independence these days, especially in this modern world, and that's why we need an International Court of Justice. There's an International Criminal Court, and the United States was a prime mover in creating this. Been very happy for other people to go to these courts in The Hague and elsewhere, war criminals from the erstwhile Yugoslavia, Charles Taylor and so forth. But the United States, Russia, and various other countries will not allow their people to be tried in front of these tribunals, which of course is grossly hypocritical. Oh, we might be subject to politically motivated prosecutions, but other countries wouldn't. Come on, it should be for everybody, especially as your government proposes it. So take the Congress of Berlin in 1885. Various European countries, the United States and the Ottoman Empire, they're all there to determine the future of Africa. And not a single African was present when that continent was carved up, leaving only two sovereign states, Liberia and Abyssinia. Liberia, of course, being a satellite of the United States, which was founded to provide a homeland for African Americans who'd returned to their ancestral continent. What else? So this is how international cooperation works, although we wouldn't consider it acceptable these days because the people who were chiefly concerned with Africa, as in Africans themselves, as I say, were entirely excluded from this conference, whereat the future of their continent was decided. And that's the way it worked back then, the great powers drawing boundaries, and we're going to come on to the big development in history there. So I don't know of any socialist who was at that Congress of Berlin. So remember, the working class only gradually got the vote through the 19th century. And the socialists were mainly concerned with the condition of the working class, trying to improve life for the average Joe, those without a higher education, without high wages. Otherwise, they could be working very long hours for poverty pay, in dirty conditions, no guarantee of a job, and life really was miserable. So we had international cooperation in the 19th century on time zones, because of course travel got so fast with trains and steamships that if the timetable was going to make any sense, we had to sort this out. You get into a train, you travel an hour, okay, and I've got my watch and chain. Remember, we only had wristwatches from the 1860s. And what's the time? Well, the village church, look at the clock tower, there's the time, or ask people, and I'll set my watch according to what people in this town say. But the thing is, if we think it's 1 o'clock in London, but in Oxford, at the very same time, they're saying it's 1:15, the train timetable is not going to make any sense. Even more so with international travel going from, say, France to Germany. So they had to sort it out, come up with Greenwich Mean Time, as in London, or these days it's called Universal Coordinated Time. So people cooperated on that, cooperated on the law of the sea, because supposing a ship registered in Panama has a Greek captain and a Filipino crew and is sailing from Mexico to Japan, carrying a cargo from Australia, whose law applies? Everybody's? Nobody's? What? That's why we need to sort it out, because we face common challenges. And so as we have these endeavours together, we've got to sort it out. And some people say, oh, national sovereignty, don't intrude my national sovereignty. Often international law backs off and lets people do as they wish. But often this has been the plea of tyrants. Well, I'm allowed to behave absolutely savagely in my own country, and you've got no business to try and save my people because it's in an internal matter. This is housekeeping. Anyway, coming on to socialists, well, there was the International Working Men's Association, founded by socialists from various different countries, chiefly European countries, and they met in London in the 1860s, if memory serves. And notice that they said Working Men's, not Working People's Association, even though a lot of women, particularly working class women, were married, even if they were married and had children, because they just had to neglect their children sometimes because they needed every penny just to put bread on the table. And remember, there were no labour-saving devices back then. No washing machine, no dishwasher, no fridge, had to get fresh food every day and all the rest of it. So then, so the Workers' International was set up and various socialist parties in various countries joined it, including in the United States. And for example, the main socialist party in France was called Section Française de Internationale des Ouvrières, the French section of the Workers' International. And there are various other conferences, the Second International, They're often called international or internationale, because it ends with an E, as in the French spelling. And John Connell, an Irishman living in London, he wrote the Internationale. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise the wretched of the earth, 'tis the final battle, and so on, saying, no faith have we in prince or peer. Oh goodness, sorry, no, he wrote the red flag. I can't remember who wrote the Internationale. It was in French originally, I think. So we don't believe in royalty, prince, peer, aristocrats, and so on. So we believe in the human race, trying to improve life for the whole of the world. That's why it's international. Okay, poverty in one country is the same as poverty in the other. We all need to eat. We all share these basic needs and concerns. Why should we try to work with each other, not against each other? And as John Hume said, you can't eat a flag. So not to say we don't have to have nations, we can't have nations at all, or national identity. Okay, that can matter, but that shouldn't be a reason not to help each other. Anyway, so it's, as I say, it's very unclear what a nation is. Look at the United States, and then it's got these treaties with these Native American nations, and they have reservations, and they're a nation within the United States. They rely on the US for defense, foreign affairs, the US dollar, but to some extent they're allowed to run their own show on the reservation. You might be in a state where casinos generally aren't permitted, however, in the reservation they are, and so it's highly complex. So, like the United Kingdom's got crown dependencies like Montserrat or Jersey, Guernsey. Contrary to common belief, they're not united, not politically. The Channel Islands. Channel Islands is a geographical, not a political expression. So coming up to the run up to the First World War, you should see Riley Ace of Spies, and a German socialist said, the European working class will not fight. Why should we workers fight for the boss class, these merchants of death, the war profiteers? From a working class Frenchman, what do I have against a working class German or a working class Bulgarian? Because we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat. It makes no difference to me what nationality someone is. We should help each other, not kill each other. For what? How does it make my life better if we have more land or a bit less land? I mean, I've still got the same job, probably still make the same amount of money. So stop caring about flags and borders and so on. And this is the ultra-nationalist trick. It's like the Nazi song, the flag is greater than death. So nationalism can be a positive force. It can bring some measure of solidarity. And it's pleasant to be sentimental about your country, all the positive aspects of one's culture. One shouldn't be chauvinistic and assume that everything to do with my culture is better, that have that much in common with people of my nationality. Seems nonsense to me to care about those just because they're my nationality or my ethnicity. Put it this way, my cousins, I've spoken to some of them for years. My second cousins, almost all of them, I wouldn't know them from Adam. So how much less do I have in common with just because someone happens to have roughly the same skin tone or be born within the same arbitrary area, an imaginary line on the map, or that kind of thing? Or have been baptized in the same sort of church, or indeed be baptized in the church at all, as opposed to brought to a mosque or a Hindu temple or anything like that. It's daft. What matters really is personality, is the individual, which to some extent is shaped by experiences and culture, but it's personality type. That really determines the behavior. If I care about my compatriots, that means I need to want to help the bad ones as well as the good ones, and not want to help the good ones of another nationality, those I actually have a rapport with, those I actually like. This is madness. Unfortunately, these are very potent forces, have such a purchase on people's feelings. So come to the First World War, and some socialists were very disappointed that socialists in almost every country took their nation's side and fought. And in Germany, there were 400 people in the Reichstag. Only one of them, Karl Liebknecht, had the courage to vote against war credits. They weren't allowed to vote in the war itself. Small anti-war protests, people like Rosa Luxemburg speaking out against it. The British Labour Party split, half of them saying there's a clear-cut moral and legal case for war, others not. James Ramsay MacDonald, the British Labour leader, said, no war is at first unpopular. And he's probably right. As it drags on, as the casualty figures mount, especially if you're losing, then popularity dips. So there's often this outburst of patriotic fervour, this madness. People are just inebriated with nationalism. And it's very alluring, and I feel it myself sometimes. I feel my scalp moving, adrenaline pumping, too touchy. There's certain words that really sting, fighting words that really get people going. But anyway, socialists tried to organise an end to the war, but there were opposition parties rather than the government in almost every country. Take the Zimmerwald left, 1915. Socialists from Central Powers countries, Allied countries, neutral countries met at Zimmerwald in Switzerland, tried to go back to the status quo ante, but it didn't happen. Lenin, Trotsky, others were there. Likewise, 1916, meeting in Zimmerwald again, but it was all to no avail. Meeting in Stockholm, Sweden in 1917, but often they were arrested to prevent them going, but they were not able to make any progress, and millions of people have been killed. So I won't talk about the Russian Revolution again, but obviously a communist state was established in Russia right after the war, and should the minor nationalities be allowed to go independent? Lenin said yes, but he quickly changed his mind on that one and reconquered these independent countries. But then they set up Comintern as in Communist International, an organization dedicated to disseminating communist propaganda and organizing communist uprisings all over the globe, but it came to naught. Now, communists by this time were very anti-imperialist. Remember, by this stage, communists and socialists were increasingly diverging, and indeed the Communist Party in Russia was fighting against various social democrat factions, such as the Mensheviks, such as the right socialist revolutionaries. So they said, oh, Vietnam should become independent, India should become independent, and so on. But Tajikistan should not, Armenia should not. Don't see quite what the logic was there, based on this fallacy that there was sort of equality within the Soviet Union, that the communists in Moscow were liberating the working class of Azerbaijan or Belarus and so on. They didn't actually want independence. Really, the reverse is the case. Morris Bauer, the Oxford Don, he later jokingly talked about Comintern as an homosexual international. So the League of Nations was founded in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And the one who did more to advocate for this idea than any other was Woodrow Wilson, the American president. But despite his vigorous vindication of the League of Nations, the US Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Because of this, it ratified the Treaty of Berlin later on. And a senator called Cabot Lodge, Henry Cabot Lodge, he spoke against it, and people listened to him in stock silence in US Senate, saying, "An American I was born." And so he ended every paragraph like that. He wasn't against the League of Nations per se, but he felt the particular model proposed was too much of an intrusion on United States sovereignty. So he reluctantly and narrowly rejected it. But that was that. So the League of Nations was set up to arbitrate international disputes. And various political movements have got their own international organizations. There's Liberal International for people of a liberal outlook. There's Democratic International for basically right-wing parties. The Conservative Party in the United Kingdom is a member of that one, and so on. And there are various other international organizations, Amnesty International, because we're all human. We all face the same problems, and so we need to discuss these things and cooperate about these things. And through things like the League of Nations, hopefully we can settle our disputes peaceably. Might not always work, but it'll work sometimes. And we have many more international organizations which are not socialist or indeed anti-socialist, like FIFA for football. For so many sports they exist. Churches were, I suppose, the first international organizations and had a charitable aspect. And there are loads of charities and NGOs which are international. Some of them faintly socialist, others not, like War on Want. And obviously the United Nations superseded the League of Nations. And of course the Allies in the Second World War simply called themselves the United Nations sometimes, though they then allowed their former enemies to join as well. So that's a little bit about socialism and globalism, but often globalism is a capitalist thing, saying we should have multinational corporations everywhere, and I work for a global company like PwC Global. I don't, that's just an example. But I don't think world government is really practical at the moment. It'd be good if we could agree on some things, like climate change, because countries vary and ideas cannot always be replicated in other lands, but we face the same problems. I mean, climate change is not going to recognize borders. Communicable diseases do not stop at the border, and people travel. Even if you don't allow them into your country, people from your country will go on holiday abroad, perhaps catch a disease, bring it back, things like that. Avian flu, swine flu, we can't keep these things out. Crime, terrorism, you won't wind us up the drug trade, loads of things, nuclear proliferation. And there was some international arms treaties to try and limit the arms trade, and Trump railed against it as global arms control. Well, you know, the United States voluntarily signed up to it. Okay, they pulled out of it. But the United States will then have no moral argument saying, well, you have to abide by your agreements, other countries with the United States, because the United States breaks its agreements all the time. So other countries will think the US is a bad faith actor, completely untrustworthy. So, yeah, there we are. That's a little bit about international cooperation. Socialism is a worldwide movement. As there is Socialist International to this day, they don't manage to achieve a great deal of cooperation, occasionally conferences, but trying to tackle poverty and privation around the world.